I want to tell you about a man I will call Arthur. He was 69 years old, a former school teacher, careful, sensible, the kind of man who read up on everything before making a decision. He had been managing mild hypertension for 3 years on medication. His cardiologist was satisfied with his numbers. His last ambulatory blood pressure recording had shown good daytime control. Arthur had one habit he was particularly proud of. Every evening at 7 p.m., he stopped drinking fluids completely. No water, no tea, nothing. He had read that reducing fluid intake before bed would help with the nocturia, the nighttime urinating that had been disturbing his sleep for years. It worked. He was sleeping through more consistently. He felt he had solved the problem sensibly and on his own terms. His last drink every evening was a cup of herbal tea at 7 p.m. After that, nothing for 2 years. Every night he went to bed in a state of progressive dehydration that he understood as responsible sleep hygiene. His wife found him at 5 in the morning. The ambulance team suspected a stroke. The post-mortem confirmed it, a massive ischemic event, a blood clot that had formed in the cerebral circulation during the overnight hours. His cardiologist, reviewing the case, noted something that his wife has asked me to share as widely as possible. Arthur had been going to bed in a state of significant dehydration every night for 2 years deliberately, because nobody had ever told him what dehydration does to blood viscosity, platelet aggregation, and clot formation risk in the overnight hours. He stopped drinking fluids to sleep better, and the research on what that habit does to the cardiovascular system while you sleep is something that most people, including many who are doing exactly the same thing tonight, have never been told. The American Heart Association and the European Society of Cardiology have both documented what cardiovascular researchers call the morning peak, the well-established elevation in heart attack and stroke risk between 5 and 10 a.m. Most people attribute this morning peak to the cortisol surge on waking, the platelet aggregation increase, and the morning blood pressure spike. All of these contribute, but there is a fourth mechanism that the morning peak conversation almost never includes, one that builds silently across the entire overnight period and reaches its most dangerous point in the early hours before waking. A study published in the American Journal of Cardiology found that blood viscosity, the thickness and resistance to flow of the blood, is significantly higher in the morning than at any other time of day, and that this morning viscosity peak is directly driven by the overnight fluid loss that occurs during sleep without any fluid replacement. Here is the counterintuitive statistic that changes this conversation entirely. Research published in Circulation found that adults who consumed adequate water before bed showed significantly lower morning blood viscosity and platelet aggregation markers than adults who restricted evening fluids, and that the difference in clot formation risk between the two groups was measurable and clinically significant. The habit most older adults adopt specifically to protect their sleep, stopping all fluids hours before bed to reduce nocturia, is the habit that leaves the blood thicker, the platelets stickier, and the arteries more vulnerable to the clot formation that produces strokes and heart attacks during the overnight window. Do not scroll past when I name this habit. Your first reaction may be, I do this. My doctor told me to do this. I am telling you now, the full picture of what it does to overnight cardiovascular risk is something most fluid restriction advice never includes. That is what this video is going to give you. During sleep, the body loses fluid continuously through respiration and insensible perspiration, approximately 400 to 600 milliliters overnight. In a typical adult, more in warmer conditions or with mouth breathing, this overnight fluid loss is unavoidable and normal. What determines whether it becomes dangerous is what the blood's fluid status was at the start of the night. In a well-hydrated adult, the overnight fluid loss produces a mild, manageable increase in blood concentration. In an adult who who deliberately restricted fluids for 3 to 5 hours before sleep. The blood enters the night already concentrated. Think of blood like a river. A healthy river flows freely around bends and obstacles. Remove enough water from that river, and it slows, it thickens, moves sluggishly, and debris that would have been carried downstream begins to settle and accumulate at the bends. The bends in the arterial system are the sites of atherosclerotic narrowing, and the debris that settles is platelets aggregating into the clots that cause strokes and heart attacks. Blood viscosity is the river's depth. Deliberate pre-sleep fluid restriction removes that depth before the most vulnerable cardiovascular hours of the night begin. Platelets, the blood cells responsible for clot formation, are significantly more active in the morning hours than at any other time of day, following a circadian rhythm that peaks between 5 and 10 a.m. This morning platelet surge is one of the primary drivers of the morning heart attack and stroke peak. Now consider what happens when that morning platelet surge occurs in blood that has been progressively concentrating across an 8-hour overnight period of zero fluid intake. The platelet concentration per unit of blood volume is higher. The platelet activity is at its circadian peak. The blood viscosity is at its daily maximum, and the arteries supplying the heart and brain, already potentially narrowed by decades of atherosclerosis, are being asked to carry this thick, platelet-rich blood through their most vulnerable regions. Think of it like rush hour traffic on a road that has been progressively narrowing all night. The morning platelet surge is the rush hour. The dehydration thick in blood is the narrowed road. The atherosclerotic plaque site is the bottleneck where the accident happens. Arthur's stroke did not happen because his arteries were suddenly different from the night before. It happened because every night for 2 years, the conditions in his cardiovascular system during the overnight hours had been moving incrementally in the wrong direction, and that Friday morning, the accumulated risk found its threshold. Nobody had told him he was building toward it deliberately, one withheld glass of water at a time. Dehydration reduces blood volume. Reduced blood volume reduces cardiac preload, the volume of blood returning to the heart with each beat. The heart responds to reduced preload by working harder to maintain adequate output, increasing heart rate and contractile force to compensate for the lower filling volume. In a young adult with a healthy heart, this compensation is efficient and largely imperceptible. In an older adult with hypertrophied cardiac muscle, reduced coronary reserve, or existing coronary artery disease, the increased cardiac workload of compensating for overnight dehydration produces a specific and measurable risk: nocturnal myocardial ischemia, insufficient blood supply to the heart muscle during the overnight period, when the heart should be operating at its lowest demand. Think of a delivery driver who cuts the fuel in the van before a long overnight route to save money at the pump. The engine runs, but it runs on reduced reserve. If any unexpected demand arises, a steep hill, a heavy load, the system that had no margin is the one that fails. Dehydration removes the cardiac margin. The overnight hours, when the heart's fuel line is already at its narrowest, the coronary arteries filling during diastole, under whatever diastolic pressure the dehydrated heart can maintain, are when that removed margin is most costly. Arthur's cardiologist shared this case because Arthur had done everything right by conventional wisdom, and conventional wisdom had a gap that cost him his life. The gap was the overnight cardiovascular consequence of deliberate pre-sleep fluid restriction. Today, I am going to give you the specific evidence-grounded replacement protocol that protects the overnight cardiovascular window without restoring the nocturia that drove the fluid restriction in the first place. Please hear this clearly. If you have heart failure, chronic kidney disease, or are on diuretic medication, speak with your cardiologist before changing your fluid intake pattern. Fluid management in these conditions requires professional supervision for everyone else. Here is what the research supports. The solution to the overnight dehydration problem is not simply to drink more before bed and accept the nocturia. It is a specific timed fluid strategy that supports overnight blood viscosity without maximizing bladder volume at sleep onset. The key insight is that fluid consumed 2 to 3 hours before bed is metabolized and distributed into the bloodstream, reducing blood viscosity before the majority of it reaches the bladder, as urine fluid consumed immediately before bed goes almost directly to the bladder. Timing is the mechanism. The protocol: drink a full glass of water, 250 milliliters, between 2 and 3 hours before intended sleep. This is the prime. Merry overnight blood viscosity management intervention. The fluid distributes into the bloodstream during the evening, reducing hematocrit and platelet concentration, and is largely processed before bladder filling becomes significant at sleep onset. A second small glass, 100 to 150 milliliters, consumed 30 to 45 minutes before bed, provides a top-up that extends hydration into the early overnight period without producing the urgency that immediately pre-bed drinking does. These two timed glasses replace the blanket fluid restriction most people practice after 6 p.m. The electrolyte addition plain water reduces blood viscosity. Water with a small amount of electrolyte, a pinch of potassium-rich sea salt, or a commercial electrolyte tablet without added sugar reduces blood viscosity while also supporting the cellular fluid retention that prevents the fluid from being immediately excreted. The electrolyte keeps more of the fluid in the vascular compartment for longer, providing sustained overnight blood viscosity reduction, rather than the brief dilution of plain water. This is the same principle that oral rehydration solutions use in clinical medicine. Electrolytes extend the hydration effect. A quarter teaspoon of potassium-rich sea salt dissolved in the evening glass of water or a commercial electrolyte tablet without added sugar is sufficient to produce this extended vascular retention effect without meaningfully increasing sodium intake at the level of cardiovascular concern. The nocturia management parallel, the goal of fluid restriction, was to reduce nocturia. The replacement protocol does not abandon that goal. It addresses it differently, elevating the legs for 30 to 60 minutes in the early evening on a footrest, on a pillow, on the sofa with feet raised, redistributes the fluid that has pooled in the legs and ankles during the day back into the central circulation where the kidneys can process and excrete it before sleep. This is the fluid that would otherwise be excreted as nocturia in the first 2 hours of the night. Draining the peripheral fluid pool before sleep reduces the overnight urinary load far more effectively than blanket fluid restriction without the cardiovascular cost. I want to stop here for a moment before we go to the 5 rules. Do you currently restrict your fluid intake in the evening to manage nocturia or sleep quality? Tell me in the comments right now. Type yes if you do. You are almost certainly not alone in this community, and your answer helps me understand what to cover next. And if this video is giving you something genuinely important, tap subscribe now. Most people watch to this point and scroll away. The next video I am publishing covers the single most underdiagnosed overnight cardiovascular risk factor in adults over 60, something that produces the same morning stroke and heart attack risk as dehydration, but through a completely different mechanism. You will want to see that before you go to sleep tonight. 5 rules that determine whether the timing protocol actually protects the overnight cardiovascular window. Rule 1. Never go to bed with fewer than 6 hours of cumulative fluid intake for the day. The overnight fluid loss of 400 to 600 milliliters is unavoidable. The blood viscosity it produces is determined by what the blood's fluid status was at the start of the night. 6 to 8 glasses of water across the day, with the final glass timed 2 to 3 hours before bed, is the minimum intake that prevents the overnight concentration from reaching the clot risk threshold. If your daily fluid intake has been lower than this, the problem begins well before bedtime. Rule 2. The 2 to 3 hour timing window is the mechanism, not just a guideline. The difference between drinking water 2 hours before bed and drinking it immediately before bed is the difference between blood viscosity protection and bladder urgency. The metabolism and vascular distribution of the fluid takes approximately 60 to 90 minutes. Fluid consumed 2 to 3 hours before sleep has completed its vascular distribution and is reducing blood viscosity during the overnight hours. Fluid consumed immediately before bed is being processed by the kidneys and arriving at the bladder at sleep onset. The timing is the pharmacology. Do not move it. Rule 3. Leg elevation in the early evening is the nocturia management tool, not fluid restriction. The fluid that produces nocturia in older adults is predominantly the fluid that has accumulated in the peripheral tissues, the legs and ankles during the day, and that is mobilized back into the central circulation when horizontal posture. Is assumed at sleep onset 30 to 60 minutes of leg elevation in the early evening. A simple footrest or pillow drains this peripheral fluid pool before sleep and dramatically reduces the nocturnal urinary load. This is the approach geriatric cardiologists use to manage nocturia in patients where fluid restriction would be cardiovascularly dangerous. It is available to anyone with a pillow. Rule 4. Morning blood viscosity is measurable. Ask for it. A simple morning blood sample, hematocrit, and serum osmolality gives a direct measurement of overnight blood concentration and hydration status. If your morning hematocrit is consistently at the high end of normal or above, overnight dehydration is a likely contributor. Bring this specific question to your next appointment. Can we check my morning hematocrit and osmolality to assess my overnight hydration status in the context of existing cardiovascular risk factors? This information is clinically relevant and the test is inexpensive. Rule 5. This protocol requires adjustment for heart failure, kidney disease, and diuretic medication. Fluid management in heart failure is a delicate clinical balance. Too much fluid increases cardiac preload and risk of pulmonary edema. Too little increases viscosity and clot risk in chronic kidney disease. Fluid intake targets vary significantly by stage and by residual kidney function. Diuretic medications alter the fluid excretion equation in ways that change the timing protocol significantly. If any of these apply, speak with your cardiologist or nephrologist before implementing any change to your evening fluid pattern. This protocol is designed for adults without these conditions. It is not a universal prescription. Arthur stopped drinking fluids every evening because he was trying to sleep better. He was trying to do right by his body, the virtue of the habit, the sensible, self-managing, responsible decision to reduce nocturia is precisely what made it invisible as a cardiovascular risk. Nobody questions a habit that feels like responsible self-care. Nobody investigates a decision that is reducing a genuine problem. And so, the blood thickened night after night, and the morning clot window grew more dangerous night after night, and nobody connected the glass of water that was not being drunk to the stroke that eventually happened at 5 in the morning. You now have that connection, and you have something Arthur did not have, the full picture tonight. Drink a full glass of water 2 to 3 hours before bed. Elevate your legs for 30 minutes in the early evening instead of restricting your fluids. And understand that the overnight hours are not neutral. Your blood is thickening or staying fluid. Your platelets are aggregating or staying dispersed. Your arteries are carrying the consequences of what you did or did not drink before the lights went out. The cardiovascular system does not sleep. It recovers if you give it the conditions to do so. One final detail. If you take aspirin for cardiovascular protection, take it with your 2 to 3 hour pre-bed glass of water, rather than in the morning. Some published research supports that evening aspirin delivery better targets the morning platelet aggregation peak, the window when clot formation risk is highest. Discuss the timing with your cardiologist, but if the timing is clinically appropriate for you. That glass of water and that aspirin tablet together address the morning clot window from two directions simultaneously. Which of these habits are you going to change tonight? Tell me in the comments. I read every response personally. Share this with someone who restricts their fluids before bed to manage their sleep. You might give them information that genuinely changes what happens while they sleep. Take care of your heart, especially during the hours you cannot watch over it yourself. I will see you in the next one.